To humiliate her, a billionaire forces his black, made to wear an outdated, unattractive dress. Yet, her grace and confidence make her the star of the evening, leaving her employer to question his own judgment. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel buzzed with New York's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the marble floors, where photographers jostled for position near the entrance. Tonight's charity event promised to be the social highlight of the season, though few knew it would become memorable for entirely unexpected reasons. Jason Carter stood at the center of an admiring crowd, his 6'2" frame commanding attention in a perfectly tailored Brioni suit. At 55, his salt and pepper hair and stern features had graced countless business magazines. The real estate mogul's latest development project, a controversial luxury complex in Brooklyn, had just cleared its final hurdle, adding another billion to his net worth. Mr. Carter, your vision for New York's skyline is revolutionary, gushed a young reporter from the Wall Street Journal, notebook in hand. They're calling you the king of real estate. Jason offered his practiced smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes. The city needs vision. Someone has to push boundaries. He gestured to the opulent room. That's what tonight is about, showing what's possible when you think big. 15 miles away, in a modest apartment in Queens, Zoe Parker stood before her bedroom mirror, holding up what could only be described as a relic. The dress Jason had provided for the evening was a dusty rose monstrosity that looked straight out of a 1950s department store window. The message was clear. This was meant to humiliate. Zoe's fingers traced the worn fabric, her mind racing. At 32, she'd spent the last 5 years as Jason Carter's executive housekeeper, managing his penthouse and staff while pursuing her fashion design degree at night. The invitation to tonight's event had initially seemed like progress. Now she understood it was just another power play. Her small bedroom told a different story than the luxury she managed daily. Sketches covered one wall, designs she'd created between cleaning schedules and staff rotations. A sewing machine sat in the corner, surrounded by fabric swatches. This room was her sanctuary, where she didn't have to be invisible. The dress laid across her bed like a challenge. Zoe's mother's words echoed in her mind. They can dress you down, but they can't steal your dignity unless you let them. With determined movements, Zoe reached for her sewing kit. 2 hours later, she stood at the plaza's service entrance, heart pounding. The dress was transformed. Strategic cuts had modernized the silhouette. A belt crafted from African print fabric, a gift from her grandmother, cinched the waist. The dusty rose now seemed elegant rather than dated. Each modification, a small act of defiance. Security guards did a double take as she presented her staff ID. "You're here as a guest?" one asked, checking his list again. Zoe lifted her chin, refusing to shrink. "Yes, I am." The walk to the main ballroom felt endless. Every step echoed with doubt. Was she really ready to step out of the shadows? To be seen? The murmur of voices grew louder as she approached the grand doors. Inside, she knew Jason Carter would be holding court, expecting her to slink in wearing his chosen costume of submission. Zoe paused, hand on the door handle. The old her might have turned back, might have called in sick, might have accepted the intended humiliation. But that version of herself had been slowly dying for years, suffocated under careful smiles and quiet "yes, sirs." She squared her shoulders, feeling the strength of generations of women who had faced worse and prevailed. The door opened, and Zoe P. Parker stepped into the light, ready to rewrite her role in this story. The gasps that followed weren't of mockery, but of admiration, though it would take her several moments to believe it. The transformation wasn't just in the dress. It was in her stance, her expression, the quiet confidence that radiated from someone who had decided, finally, to be fully seen. As conversations paused and heads turned, Zoe caught Jason's eye across the room. His expression shifted from expectant smugness to confusion, then something darker. The game had changed, and they both knew it. The ballroom's energy shifted as Zoe made her entrance. Conversations stuttered to a halt. Champagne glasses paused midway to lips, and the constant click of photographers' cameras created a staccato backdrop to the moment. The dress that was meant to be her shame had become her spotlight. A well-known fashion editor from Vogue was the first to break from her circle of socialites, moving towards Zoe with purpose. "That silhouette is remarkable," she said, circling Zoe with an appraising eye. "The fusion of vintage structure with modern elements. It's exactly what we've been discussing for our upcoming feature on sustainable fashion." More guests gravitated towards Zoe, drawn by the editor's obvious interest. The crowd around her grew, pushing aside the invisible barriers that typically separated service staff from New York's elite. A Broadway producer complimented her choice of accessories. An art gallery owner praised the cultural elements woven into the design. From his position near the main bar, Jason Carter watched the scene unfold with growing displeasure. This wasn't how the evening was supposed to go. The dress had been carefully chosen, a relic from his late mother's attic, selected specifically to put Zoe in her place. Instead, she had turned his weapon into her shield. "Quite the unexpected turn of events," commented Richard Walsh, one of Jason's biggest investors, raising an eyebrow. "Your housekeeper seems to be the belle of the ball." Jason forced a laugh, too loud and sharp. "Well, you know how these charity events are. Everyone's always looking for something different to talk about." He emphasized the word different with a slight sneer, but Richard had already turned away, moving towards Zoe's growing circle of admirers. The situation worsened when Maya Washington entered the scene. As the founder of the Civil Rights Action Coalition and a regular on national news networks, Maya had a reputation for confronting inequality head-on. She'd been invited because her presence lent credibility to the event's charitable pretenses. Now, she stood observing the dynamic with keen interest. "Mr. Carter," Maya called out, her voice carrying across the room with practiced authority. "I didn't expect your event to feature such a powerful statement about transformation and empowerment." Her words were precise, pointed, though I wonder if that was your intention when you selected that particular dress for your employee to wear. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Nearby conversations hushed as people turned to watch the exchange. Jason's hand tightened around his whiskey glass. "Maya," he responded, attempting to maintain his usual air of casual authority. "I'm afraid you're reading too much into a simple wardrobe choice. Though I must admit, Zoe has surprised us all tonight." "Surprises can be educational," Maya pressed, moving closer. "They force us to examine our expectations, don't they? Our biases?" She smiled, but her eyes remained challenging. "For instance, I wonder how many people here tonight assumed Zoe was just another guest until you labeled her as your employee?" The tension in the room thickened. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, aware they were witnessing more than just casual conversation. Jason's reputation for controlling every aspect of his environment was well known. Now, that control was visible. Zoe, still surrounded by admirers, couldn't help but overhear the exchange. She stayed focused on her conversations, discussing her design choices with genuine passion. But her awareness of Jason's discomfort was acute. Each compliment she received felt like both a victory and a danger. Maya continued her subtle interrogation, each question peeling back layers of Jason's carefully constructed image. "Tell me, Mr. Carter, do all your employees have such creative talent? Or perhaps they haven't been given the opportunity to show it?" Jason's attempt to steer the conversation toward his charitable works fell flat, as Maya persistently brought the focus back to Zoe and the broader implications of the evening's events. The whispers among the guests grew louder, more speculative. The power dynamics in the room were shifting. Jason Carter, who had orchestrated this evening as another display of his influence, found himself increasingly isolated. His usual circle of sycophants had drifted toward the evening's unexpected star, leaving him exposed to Maya's calculated observations. As the scene unfolded, photographers who had initially clustered around Jason began gravitating toward Zoe. Each camera flash illuminated a new reality. The king of real estate was no longer the center of attention at his own event, and his attempt to humiliate had backfired spectacularly. The evening was young, but already the carefully scripted narrative was unraveling. In its place, a new story was emerging, one that would force everyone present especially Jason Carter, to confront uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and the courage it takes to rewrite the rules of engagement. Alessandro Rossi, creative director of one of Milan's most prestigious fashion houses, cut through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone used to commanding attention. His keen eye had been following Zoe's movements for the past hour, noting how the reconstructed dress moved with her, how she carried herself with natural elegance. "Remarkable," he said, approaching Zoe with purposeful strides. "The way you've deconstructed this vintage piece while maintaining its essential character. It's precisely the fresh perspective we've been seeking." His Italian accent added weight to his words as he circled her, professional interest evident in his gaze. Jason Carter, still smarting from Maya's earlier confrontation, watched the interaction with growing alarm. Alessandro was supposed to be discussing a potential retail space in Jason's newest development. Instead, the designer was thoroughly engaged with his housekeeper, discussing fabric choices and design philosophy. "The African print belt, it's not just an accessory, is it?" Alessandro asked, his fingers hovering over the fabric. "It's a statement of identity, of heritage. This is exactly what modern fashion needs: authenticity, story, purpose." Zoe's response was measured but confident. "My grandmother taught me that fashion isn't just about clothes. It's about carrying your history with pride, about transformation." She touched the belt lightly. "This fabric tells stories that the original dress couldn't." Alessandro's eyes lit up. "You must come to Milan. We're planning a collection focused on sustainable fashion and cultural fusion. Your perspective would be invaluable." He pulled out his business card, a simple black square with raised silver text. "We should discuss this properly." From his increasingly isolated position near the bar, Jason's face darkened. His employee, his housekeeper, was being offered opportunities by people who usually sought his approval first. The power structure he'd carefully maintained was crumbling before his eyes. Maya Washington, who had been observing the scene with calculated interest, chose this moment to approach Jason again. This time, her questions cut deeper. "Fascinating how talent finds its way to the surface, isn't it, Mr. Carter?" she began, positioning herself so he couldn't easily escape the conversation. "Despite systematic barriers, despite intentional obstacles." She emphasized the last words while glancing meaningfully at the transformed dress. Jason attempted to deflect. "Maya, surely you're not suggesting dash." "I'm not suggesting anything," she interrupted smoothly. "I'm stating facts. You gave your educated, skilled employee a dress meant to shame her. Instead, she turned it into an opportunity. The question is, what does that say about your judgment? About your ability to recognize and nurture talent within your organization?" The surrounding guests pretended not to listen while hanging on every word. Jason's reputation for being a shrewd judge of potential was part of his carefully crafted image. Maya's questions weren't just uncomfortable. They were threatening to unravel years of careful brand building. Zoe, sensing the mounting tension, excused herself from Alessandro's enthusiastic planning and moved toward the bar. She needed a moment to process the evening's unexpected turns. The bartender, Marcus, who had served at Carter events for years, gave her a subtle nod of approval as he prepared her usual gin and tonic. "You're showing them all tonight, Ms. Parker," Marcus murmured, adding a perfect lime wedge to her drink. "About time somebody did." This small gesture of solidarity from a fellow service worker strengthened Zoe's resolve. She'd stepped into this evening prepared for humiliation, but found validation instead. The decision to transform the dress hadn't just been about fashion. It had been about refusing to accept the limitations others tried to impose. Meanwhile, Jason's attempts to regain control of the situation grew increasingly desperate. He tried to steer conversations back to his business achievements, his charitable contributions, his vision for the city. But the usual sycophants were distracted, more interested in the unexpected story unfolding before them. The evening had become a powder keg of social dynamics, with Maya continuously striking matches through her incisive questions about workplace power structures and systemic discrimination. Each time Jason tried to establish his authority, she found a new way to expose the prejudices underlying his actions. Alessandro's continued attention to Zoe served as a visible reminder of what Jason had failed to see, or chose not to see, in his own employee. The designer was already making calls, arranging meetings, speaking of collaborations and opportunities. Each plan he discussed was another crack in Jason's facade of control. The night was far from over, and the tensions were only beginning to surface. As Zoe sipped her drink at the bar, gathering strength for whatever came next, she couldn't help but wonder how many other talented people remained invisible in plain sight, waiting for their moment to shine. Near the grand piano, a heated discussion about contemporary art had broken out among a group of collectors and gallery owners. They were debating the merits of an upcoming exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art when Zoe, passing by, overheard a comment about African influences in modern abstract expressionism. "Actually," she said before she could stop herself, "if you look at Willem de Kooning's early work, particularly his Woman series, you can see clear parallels with traditional African mask aesthetics, especially in the fragmentation of facial features." The group turned, surprised by this interjection from someone they'd assumed was just another pretty face at a charity event. Harrison Wells, a prominent art dealer, raised an eyebrow with interest. "You're familiar with de Kooning's work?" he asked, making space for her to join their circle. "I took several art history courses during my degree," Zoe explained. "The intersection of Western modern art with African cultural influences has always fascinated me. It's similar to what's happening in fashion today, this constant dialogue between cultures and traditions." The conversation quickly evolved, with Zoe offering insights about the colonial gaze in modern art and the importance of acknowledging cultural sources. Her knowledge wasn't just superficial. She spoke with the depth of someone who had spent years studying and contemplating these subjects. Jason Carter, attempting to interrupt what he saw as an increasingly problematic situation, approached the group with forced joviality. "I hope my housekeeper isn't boring you with her hobby interests," he said, his tone deliberately dismissive. The attempt at diminishment fell flat. Rebecca Chun, a curator from the Whitney Museum, was in the middle of noting down Zoe's contact information. "Your housekeeper, Mr. Carter? Perhaps you should consider her as your art consultant instead. Her analysis of contemporary art market trends is more insightful than many professionals I know." Several other guests nodded in agreement, effectively dismissing Jason's attempt to reassert control. He stood there, increasingly isolated, as the conversation continued without him. The situation escalated when Victoria Palmer, editor of Style and Society magazine, approached the group. "I couldn't help overhearing," she said, directing her attention to Zoe. "We're planning a feature on emerging voices in art criticism, focusing on perspectives that challenge traditional Eurocentric viewpoints. Would you be interested in contributing?" Before Zoe could respond, Jason attempted to intervene again. "I'm sure Zoe is flattered, but she has responsibilities that dash. I would love to contribute," Zoe interrupted firmly, meeting Victoria's eyes. "I have several pieces already written about the commercialization of cultural art forms and the responsibility of modern creators to acknowledge their influences." The group's attention remained fixed on Zoe, while Jason's attempts to redirect the conversation became increasingly awkward and ignored. His usual commanding presence seemed to shrink with each passing moment. Leonardo Martinez, a prominent fashion photographer, joined the discussion, his eyes lighting up as he observed Zoe's transformed dress and listened to her articulate analysis of cultural fusion in art and fashion. "This is exactly what we need for our upcoming campaign," he declared. "Someone who understands both the aesthetic and intellectual aspects of cultural dialogue and fashion. The dress you're wearing, it's a perfect physical manifestation of the theories you're discussing." Jason's face reddened. His employee wasn't just outshining him socially now. She was being offered opportunities that would take her out of his control completely. The carefully maintained power dynamic of their relationship was crumbling before his eyes. "I believe my employee is forgetting her place." He attempted one last time, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "On the contrary, Mr. Carter," Rebecca Chin responded coolly. "I believe she's finally finding it." The assembled guests murmured in agreement, effectively shutting down Jason's protest. The man who had started the evening as the center of attention now stood on the periphery, watching as his carefully constructed world shifted on its axis. The message was clear. Zoe's intelligence and insight, combined with her artistic talent, had carved out a space for her that transcended the artificial boundaries Jason had tried to maintain. His attempt to humiliate her had instead created a platform for her to showcase not just her design skills, but her intellectual depth. In a quiet corner of the ballroom, a group of prominent business leaders had formed their own circle, speaking in low voices about the evening's unexpected developments. Among them was Richard Walsh, Jason's longtime investor, and Sarah Henderson, CEO of a major tech company. "Did you know," Sarah whispered, swirling her champagne, "that Zoe managed Carter's entire household operations while pursuing her DEGRA? My assistant looked her up. She graduated summa cum laude from FIT last year." While working full-time, Richard shook his head. "Carter never mentioned any of this, though I suppose that's telling in itself." The conversation rippled through various groups, each adding new pieces to the puzzle. A human resources director from a Fortune 500 company joined in, her expression concerned. "This is exactly what we've been fighting against in corporate America. Talented individuals hidden in plain sight, their potential deliberately suppressed." Jason Carter stood alone near a window, watching these conversations unfold. His usual crowd of admirers had dispersed, drawn into the orbit of the evening's unexpected star. He observed as Zoe navigated the room with natural grace, her intellectual engagement with guests making his earlier attempts to humiliate her seem increasingly petty. Even his most loyal supporters were beginning to distance themselves. Marcus Davidson, his golf partner and fellow real estate developer, had spent the last 20 minutes deeply engaged in conversation with Zoe about urban development and community impact, topics Jason had always dismissed as secondary to profit. "Your perspective on sustainable community development is fascinating," Marcus was saying to Zoe. "The way you connect architectural aesthetics with cultural preservation, it's exactly what the industry needs to consider." Maya Washington, ever observant, approached Jason in his moment of isolation. She didn't speak immediately, letting the silence emphasize his discomfort. "It's different being on the outside, isn't it?" she finally said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Watching others control the narrative about who belongs where?" Jason attempted to maintain his composure, but his fingers tightened around his whiskey glass. "You're enjoying this," he accused. "This isn't about enjoyment, Mr. Carter. This is about recognition, something you've actively denied to someone in your employment. The question is, what will you do with this revelation?" Before he could respond, a burst of laughter drew their attention. Zoe was surrounded by a group of young entrepreneurs, sharing a story about her grandmother's influence on her design philosophy. The genuine warmth and engagement in the scene contrasted sharply with the forced networking that usually characterized these events. Jason found himself studying Zoe with new eyes, seeing what he had deliberately ignored: her poise, her intelligence, her ability to connect with people across social boundaries. The dress he had chosen as a weapon of humiliation now seemed to mock him instead, transformed into a symbol of resilience and creativity. A photographer from Vogue approached Zoe, requesting a few shots for their social media coverage. As she posed naturally, the flash of cameras illuminated her confidence, making Jason's position in the shadows feel even more pronounced. "Your world is changing, Mr. Carter," Maya observed. "The question is whether you'll change with it or be left behind." The evening had shifted into something unrecognizable to Jason. His carefully curated image as a benevolent business leader was being quietly dismantled, not through direct confrontation, but through the stark contrast between his actions and Zoe's grace under pressure. He made an awkward attempt to join a conversation about modern art and architecture, only to find himself unable to contribute meaningfully. The guests, who hours ago would have laughed at his every joke, now politely but firmly maintained their focus on Zoe's insights about sustainable design and cultural preservation. The isolation was foreign to him. For decades, Jason had been the one who decided who was in and who was out. Now, he found himself on the wrong side of that divide, watching as his employee, a woman he had tried to diminish, commanded the respect and attention he had always taken for granted. The party had reached that point in the evening where the initial excitement had settled into deeper, more intimate conversations. In one corner, a group of guests gathered around an elderly philanthropist Margaret Shun, who was sharing her story of immigrating to America with nothing but determination and a dream. "When I see you," Margaret said, reaching for Zoe's hand, "I see the same fire I had, the same refusal to be defined by others' limitations." Her words carried across the room, weighted with decades of experience. "But you have something more, the courage to transform opposition into opportunity." Jason Carter, still hovering on the periphery, felt each word like a personal indictment. From his new position as an outsider, he began to see his actions through a different lens. The crystal tumbler in his hand had been refilled several times, but the alcohol did nothing to dull his growing discomfort. He watched as Zoe engaged with Margaret, their conversation drawing in others who shared similar stories of overcoming prejudice and breaking barriers. The dress that he had chosen as an instrument of shame had become a talking point for discussions about resilience and creativity. "You know," said David Powell, one of Jason's oldest business partners, appearing beside him, "I remember when my father used to run his company the way you do. Kept talented people in their place. Lost some of the best minds in the industry because of it." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Nearly bankrupted us before we learned to change." Jason turned to defend himself, but David had already moved away, joining the group around Zoe. The isolation felt suffocating. He found himself before one of the ballroom's ornate mirrors, staring at his reflection. The image that looked back at him, the successful, powerful real estate mogul, suddenly seemed hollow. A server passed with champagne, and for the first time that evening, Jason noticed how the staff watched Zoe. Their subtle nods, their proud smiles. They saw her success as their own. He realized with growing unease how many talented individuals might be serving drinks or checking coats, their potential buried under his preconceptions. The mirror reflected another scene. Alessandro Rossi enthusiastically describing his vision for a collaboration with Zoe, his hands moving animatedly as he spoke about revolutionizing sustainable fashion. The Italian designer's excitement was genuine, untainted by the usual monetary calculations that dominated these events. "It's not just about fashion," Alessandro was saying. "It's about challenging the industry's assumptions, about proving that brilliance can come from anywhere if we only have the wisdom to recognize it." Jason's carefully constructed worldview was crumbling. Each conversation he overheard, each glance that passed over him to focus on Zoe, chipped away at his certainties. The power he had wielded so confidently now felt like a weight dragging him down. He retreated to a quiet balcony, seeking escape from the shifting dynamics inside. The New York skyline spread before him, buildings he had helped shape reaching toward the stars. But even this view, usually a source of pride, offered no comfort. Inside, the party continued to evolve. Zoe had become the gravitational center of meaningful discussions about change in various industries. Her story, of pursuing education while working, of maintaining dignity in the face of deliberate humiliation, of transforming an act of malice into a moment of triumph, resonated deeply with the gathered guests. Jason observed all this from his self-imposed exile, feeling increasingly like a relic of a dying era. The confidence that had carried him through decades of business deals and social events had evaporated, leaving behind uncomfortable questions about his role in maintaining systems of oppression. The mirror caught his reflection again as he re-entered the ballroom. This time, he barely recognized himself. The man who had arrived hours ago, certain of his position and power, had been replaced by someone grappling with the consequences of his actions and beliefs. The evening had reached its pivotal moment. As donors prepared to make their pledges for the charity, the traditional time for speeches arrived. The event coordinator approached Zoe, rather than Jason, with a microphone, a subtle but significant breach of protocol that didn't go unnoticed. "Ms. Parker," she said, "several guests have requested that you share a few words about your experience tonight." The room fell silent as Zoe took her position at the podium. The transformed dress seemed to glow under the spotlight, each modification telling its own story of resistance and creativity. She took a deep breath, her hands steady on the polished wood. "When I received this dress," she began, her voice clear and measured, It was meant to be a reminder of my place. An antiquated garment for someone deemed antiquated in value. She paused, letting the words settle. But every attempt to diminish us carries within it the seeds of our empowerment, if we choose to plant them. The audience was completely still, even the servers pausing in their duties to listen. Jason, from his position near the bar, felt each word like a physical force. Dignity isn't given to us by others, Zoe continued. It's inherent in who we are. When we understand that, every act of discrimination becomes an opportunity to demonstrate our worth. This dress wasn't just transformed by needle and thread. It was transformed by the recognition that no one can define our value but ourselves. Maya Washington nodded approvingly, while Alessandro Rossi wiped away an unexpected tear. The room was charged with emotion, years of similar experiences resonating with Zoe's words. In every workplace, in every industry, there are people like me. Talented individuals whose potential is capped not by their abilities, but by others' perceptions. Tonight isn't just about one dress or one event. It's about acknowledging that excellence doesn't respect artificial boundaries of class, race, or position. Several CEOs in the audience shifted uncomfortably, perhaps thinking of similar talents hidden within their own organizations. The weight of unspoken stories filled the room. Jason found himself moving toward the podium, drawn by an impulse he didn't fully understand. The alcohol in his system made his steps less steady than usual, but his mind was surprisingly clear. When he reached the microphone, the room tensed, anticipating confrontation. He gripped the podium, looking out at the sea of faces. For the first time in his career, he felt the full weight of their judgment, their expectations. The script he had lived by for so long suddenly seemed inadequate. He started, then stopped. The practice charm that had served him so well in countless speeches abandoned him. Zoe stood nearby, her presence a reminder of everything he had failed to see. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Phones emerged from pockets and purses, recording what promised to be either a moment of redemption or public self-destruction. Jason Carter, king of real estate, found himself stripped of his usual armor of wealth and influence. Maya Washington watched intently, her expression both challenging and expectant. The moment teetered on the edge of something significant, either a genuine acknowledgement of fault and promise of change, or another attempt to reassert control through superficial charm. The room waited, collective breath held, as Jason Carter faced the consequences of his actions in front of New York's elite. The narrative he had carefully constructed over decades hung by a thread, ready to either evolve or unravel completely. Jason's hands gripped the podium tighter, his knuckles white under the unforgiving spotlight. The silence in the room had become almost physical, pressing in from all sides. When he finally spoke his voice, he was stripped of its usual polish. I built my career, he began slowly, on identifying value, on seeing potential where others missed it. He paused, swallowing hard. Tonight has shown me that I've failed spectacularly at my own game. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Phones continued recording, capturing this unprecedented moment of vulnerability from one of New York's most notorious power brokers. I gave Zoe that dress as a weapon, he continued, the words seeming to pain him physically. I chose it specifically to remind her of what I considered her place. In doing so, I didn't just show poor judgment. I revealed my own prejudices, my own limitations. Maya Washington's expression remained neutral, but her eyes tracked every micro-expression on Jason's face, searching for authenticity in his confession. The truth is, Jason's voice cracked slightly, I've been operating on outdated assumptions that have no place in today's world. Worse, I've been actively suppressing talent that could have contributed to not just my company, but to our entire industry. The room was absolutely still. Even the servers had stopped moving, standing like statues along the walls. Zoe watched Jason with an unreadable expression, her transformed dress a silent testimony to everything he was saying. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he continued, meeting Zoe's eyes directly. What I did was calculated and cruel. Instead, I'm acknowledging my failure, not just to Zoe, but to countless others who've worked for me over the years. People whose potential I chose not to see because it was more convenient to keep them in their place. A few guests nodded slowly, perhaps recognizing similar behaviors in themselves. Others looked uncomfortable, as if Jason's confession forced them to confront their own biases. "This isn't about one dress or one evening," Jason said, echoing Zoe's earlier words. "It's about a systemic problem that I've been part of perpetuating. And while I can't undo years of prejudiced thinking in one night, I can commit to change." He turned to face Zoe directly now, his practiced public persona completely stripped away. "I owe you an apology that goes beyond words. Your talent, your intelligence, your dignity in the face of my attempt to humiliate you. They all speak to a character I failed to recognize because I chose not to look." The room's reaction was mixed. Some guests appeared moved by his vulnerability, while others remained skeptical, perhaps waiting to see if actions would follow these words. Maya's slight nod suggested cautious approval of this first step. "Mr. Carter," Zoe spoke up, her voice steady. "Apologies are important, but they're just the beginning. Real change requires action, not just words." "You're right," Jason acknowledged, running a hand through his hair in an uncharacteristically nervous gesture. "Which is why I'm announcing tonight that my company will be launching a comprehensive review of our hiring and promotion practices, starting immediately." The tension in the room shifted slightly. Business reporters present began typing furiously on their phones, recognizing the news value of this unexpected announcement. Furthermore, Jason continued, seeming to gain strength from the commitment to concrete action. "I'm establishing a foundation to support underrepresented talent in design and development with Zoe, if she's willing, as one of the board members." The gasps and murmurs that followed suggested that no one, including Zoe, had expected this development. The power dynamic had shifted irreversibly, transforming what had begun as an act of humiliation into a catalyst for genuine change. As the formal portion of the evening wound down, the ballroom hummed with charged energy. Small groups formed and reformed, discussing the unprecedented events they'd witnessed. Jason's public confession and subsequent announcements had transformed what was meant to be a routine charity event into a watershed moment for New York's business community. Media representatives huddled in corners, frantically updating their stories. The narrative had shifted from a standard society page piece about charitable giving to a much more compelling story about power, prejudice, and the possibility of redemption. Zoe found herself in a quiet corner with Alessandro Rossi and several other industry leaders. The Italian designer was already sketching out plans on a napkin, his excitement palpable. "We'll start with a capsule collection," Alessandro explained, his pen moving quickly across the paper. "Your story, your vision, it's exactly what the industry needs right now. We'll launch during Milan Fashion Week, but with a twist. Instead of traditional models, we'll showcase designs on women who've broken barriers in their fields." Maya Washington joined their conversation, adding another layer to the discussion. "This could be more than fashion," she suggested. "It's an opportunity to highlight systemic changes across industries." The foundation Jason proposed, if structured correctly, could create real pathways for talent that's been historically overlooked. Meanwhile, Jason was engaged in an intense conversation with his legal team and HR directors who had been present at the event. The promised review of company practices couldn't wait until Monday. Plans needed to be set in motion immediately. "We'll need a complete audit," his head of HR was saying, already creating action items on her tablet. "Hiring practices, promotion patterns, salary equity. Everything needs to be examined and restructured." Jason nodded, looking both exhausted and somehow lighter than he had in years. "Whatever resources you need," he assured them. "This isn't a PR exercise, I want real change." The designer who had been so impressed with Zoe earlier approached her with renewed purpose. "I'd like to schedule a proper meeting," he said, handing her his business card. "Your perspective on sustainable fashion and cultural fusion, it's exactly what we've been looking for. And now, with the foundation's support, the possibilities seem to expand with each conversation." What had started as a story of attempted humiliation was evolving into something far more significant. Other business leaders present began approaching Jason, not with the usual sycophantic praise, but with serious questions about implementing similar changes in their own organizations. Zoe observed all this with a mixture of pride and caution. She'd spent years working within a system that undervalued her, and while tonight's events were promising, she knew that real change would require sustained effort and accountability. "You know," she said to Maya, who had become something of an ally throughout the evening, "this dress will need to become more than just a symbol. We need to ensure these promises translate into actual opportunities for others." Maya smiled, her experience in civil rights battles evident in her measured response. "That's exactly why we need people like you on the inside now. Your voice, your experience, they're going to be crucial in shaping how these initiatives develop." As the evening drew to a close, the initial buzz of Jason's confession had transformed into serious discussions about implementation and accountability. Business cards were exchanged, meetings were scheduled, and commitments were made with an urgency that suggested real change might be possible. Jason watched from a distance as Zoe navigated these conversations with natural diplomacy. His world had been upended, but in its place, something more meaningful was taking shape. The foundation he proposed wasn't just about making amends. It was about recognizing and nurturing talent that he and others had been too prejudiced to see. As the evening approached its conclusion, Jason's phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. The caller ID displayed his chief financial officer's name, unusual for this hour. When he answered, the news hit him like a physical blow. "Jason, we have a situation." His CFO's voice was tense. "Goldman's pulling out. They've received documentation about systematic discrimination in our hiring practices. The shares are going to plummet when the market opens on Monday." Before Jason could fully process this information, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. Rebecca Chun, a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, was making her way through the crowd, tablet in hand. "Mr. Carter," she called out, her voice carrying across the now quieting room, "would you care to comment on the class action lawsuit being filed against Carter Enterprises? We have evidence of systematic discrimination spanning the last decade." The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted instantly. The warmth generated by Jason's earlier confession froze into something more complex. Phones began buzzing throughout the room as the news broke across multiple platforms. "The lawsuit," Rebecca continued, reading from her tablet, "includes testimony from over 50 former employees, documenting patterns of discrimination in hiring, promotion, and compensation. The allegations span all departments of Carter Enterprises." Jason's face drained of color as he realized the full scope of what was unfolding. His earlier confession, meant as a step toward redemption, now appeared to some as an admission of guilt that would strengthen the legal case against him. But the real shock came when Zoe stepped forward, her transformed dress now seeming to carry an additional layer of meaning. "I believe I can add some context to this," she said, her voice clear and steady. "For the past 3 years, while working as Mr. Carter's housekeeper, I've been documenting every instance of discrimination I witnessed or experienced." She reached in her clutch bag and removed a small USB drive. "This contains emails, recorded conversations, and detailed records of discriminatory practices within Carter Enterprises. I provided copies to the legal team representing the plaintiffs." The room erupted in gasps and whispers. What had seemed like a story of personal redemption suddenly revealed itself as something far more calculated and consequential. "You see, Mr. Carter," Zoe continued, addressing him directly, "when you gave me that dress, you didn't just give me an opportunity to demonstrate my creativity. You gave me a platform to expose years of systematic discrimination. Your attempt to humiliate me became the perfect stage for revealing the truth." Maya Washington stepped forward, now revealing her own role. The Civil Rights Action Coalition has been building this case for months. Tonight's events, while unscripted, provided the perfect catalyst for its release. Jason staggered slightly, reaching for support against a nearby table. The evening's transformation from triumph to tragedy was complete. His phone continued buzzing with messages from board members, investors, and lawyers, all demanding immediate responses. "Your confession earlier was admirable," Maya added, her tone professional but firm. "But real change requires more than words. Sometimes it requires the system to be shocked into transformation. The media presence in the room had doubled as word spread. Photographers who had been capturing the charity event now documented the unfolding drama. The contrast between Jason's earlier vulnerability and his current shock made for compelling images. Zoe stood tall in her transformed dress, no longer just a symbol of personal triumph, but now an emblem of systematic change. The very dress that was meant to shame her had become historic evidence in what promised to be a landmark discrimination case. "The foundation you proposed," she said to Jason, "was a good start. But true change sometimes requires dismantling the old structures entirely. Your actions tonight prove that you can recognize your mistakes. Now you'll have to answer for them legally." As the story spread across social media and news outlets, the charity event transformed into something else entirely. The night when one of New York's most powerful real estate empires began to crumble, undone by its own prejudices and the courage of those who refused to remain silent. The evening ended not with charitable pledges, but with the service of legal papers, the flash of cameras, and the realization that sometimes true justice wears an unexpected dress.